Hey there, this is Fatmarrow, and I was going to talk to you today about making some collision hulls, which is about as exciting as the real hull, which I think has been done an injustice, and I've nothing against hull. But first, before I do that, I want to touch on something I talked about last time, which was when my materials stopped working, my landscape materials, and I found the cause of that. Which was, I think, that Epic had changed one of their starter material textures, or maybe it's an engine texture, and that had a knock-on effect on making everything break. So there is this, which I'll talk about more generally. So a lot of my materials have a sort of macro texture, so that when you get further away, they don't appear to be repeating quite as obviously. So if you look at this wall texture, it's a fairly high resolution texture, it's a 2K texture, high res by my standards, and it does repeat. It tiles. I don't know if you can see the tiling there, and there, but it's a bit less obvious because of this macro texture, which basically is a sort of larger scale blotch. Let me just find that texture in my list of many textures, and we'll have a look what's going on here. So this is my material, and it's got a diffuse texture, which is most of what you see. It's got a normal map, and it's got in addition a height map, which I'm using to generate a normal map. The reason I'm doing it this way, which is a bit less efficient, is so that I can do the blends that I showed you a while back, where I blended some vegetation onto the wall and used the fact that these sort of bumps are defined to let the vegetation creep into the gaps before it goes over the bricks for a more pleasing natural effect. Anyway, but that's the basis of the texture, and the blotches come from this little function here, which I defined, which takes as an input, I mean arbitrarily, the scale of the blotches, the multiply value where a lower value is a greater effect, and the texture coordinates, which you just take from your basic texture coordinate parameter. So to show an example of the detail effect, if I change that to 1, that turns off the effect. Let's see if I can go back to that. So that is the material with the texture turned off, and you can see that it looks a bit more like a classic old school texture with sort of, even the minor inconsequential details start to look obvious when they're tiled. And if I just, let's see, turn that back on to what it was, 0.6, you can see the blotches. So there it's quite a natural sort of value. If I make it extreme, it's a bit more obvious where the blotches are, and they don't tend to work so well. It looks a little bit dirty, but not in a good way. And that's not even meant to be a double entendre. But let's pretend it was. So that's a slightly sort of fairly natural looking blob. So why am I showing you that? Because this function, which what's going on? Which is here, is basically taken from one of the Unreal materials, and I just abstracted it to this function to save me making the same thing in all the materials. And actually also it had the added benefit that the problem that occurred with this texture I could fix centrally in most cases, but my older materials, which I've been using on my older maps, had this sort of hard-coded into the material itself, and they had to be individually tweaked. And what happened was that these textures, it's the T macro variation, and this is basically there, it's just a blotch, sort of detailed dirt, and what this does is it takes your basic texture coordinate and it scales it with that parameter, and it multiplies it with these numbers, which are deliberately, they don't have a, let's see, a highest common factor, lowest common denominator. Anyway, they basically don't tile on each other, and they sort of recreate this pattern at multiple scales so that the result is a blotchy and not an obvious tile over quite a range of scales and distances and so on. And that's just tweaked so that it ends up with a single value which is then multiplied by your diffuse texture, which basically varies from 1 being there's basically no change to making it go a bit lower. In blotches it sort of dips down to lower values to make the texture darker where it needs to be. So that's fairly basic, but what happened here was this used to be sampler type color, and then it became a linear color, and whether that's a change in 4.13, which I'm currently working on, and we're up to 4.16 at the moment. If that's a change in 4.13, possibly it may even be that I changed something inadvertently, but the result was that all of these references to the macro variation have to be changed to a linear color sampler. So if your materials suddenly stop working and you're not sure why, it does often give an error down at the bottom, but what I found was that for some of the materials it only gave one error for one of the materials, and then it didn't seem to complain about an error even though the error was still there. My landscape materials were using material functions, so it wasn't quite clear where the error was coming in. Took a bit of debugging to work that one out. So that's the basic problem I had. So I went back to all my old materials, and let's see, I can do the tweak here because I think I didn't finish. So I used a lot of the starter content materials because a lot of these are perfectly fine, perfectly usable. And there's one that's not working. And I found that even the starter materials had broken, so perhaps one of the updates changed that macro texture. Yeah, so something broke that. Here's the starter material which is still broken. Let's have a look. And I don't know why that's there. And so to fix this, I'm just going to select all these, sampler type, linear color, and there we go. So if you're having the same problem, there's the fix. And back we come. So I'm going to move on now and talk about collision hulls, as I promised, saving the best for last. So this is my level. Let's just have a little play. It's a bit slow. No, it's not. So you walk around, you bash into things. That's what you want, really, isn't it? Let's go over here. Zoink. Oh no, there's no collision hulls. So I need to sort that out. So when you take a simple asset like a chair from the starter content, it's probably going to be done right. And I do like looking at Epic stuff because they just do a nice job on this stuff. I'm never going to make something that nice. A simple thing done nicely. Now, so in the mesh view, you can look at the collision, and you can see there's two things going on here. This sort of cyan coloured stuff is the actual mesh. You can see the polygons to make up the mesh. That is the complex collision surface, which I think is a synonym for just the actual polygons of the mesh. And so you can test the collisions against something by just seeing if you have gone through a polygon in the mesh. Given here there's about 1,700 triangles, that's quite a lot of tests to do. And so what they tend to do instead is to have a much simpler collision hull, which is this purple thing. And that is a simple sort of, let's see, convex, concave. Convex, the one that's not got any inward bits. So yes, convex. I think we were saying convex. So a convex polygon, it's got a certain number of sides. It's not quite sort of symmetrical about all axes, but it's a very simple polygon, and that's what it uses to test for whether you've collided with this chair. And this will suffice for certain things like Unreal Tournament, where it's not particularly sophisticated. You're running around like headless chickens firing rocket launchers. You're not too fussed about collisions. Some other games like Ground Branch, which is the thing I'm a little bit involved with, trying to do maps for it, unofficially I might add. You've got things like weapon collision, where when you swing your gun around, that is like an extension of you, and that has to collide against things. And so you might want a slightly more sophisticated collision system for that, because you'll probably notice as you swing your gun around that you're hitting mid-air. It's a slightly unsatisfying thing, but that's my take on it anyway. I think you need to have a slightly more sophisticated collision hull for that to work satisfactorily. And you can have different things having different tests. So some things in your game can test against the high quality collision hull, the actual per poly collision, the complex case. So for example, if you're firing bullets at things, you will have bullets hitting surfaces and leaving decals or decals, if you pronounce that, so leaving bullet marks, and in any event you want that to be more sophisticated, because if you're hiding behind a chair you don't want to be protected by an invisible force field just because the collision hull looks like that. So ballistics tend to be done per poly with a complex case. Moving your character around tends to be the simple case, which is these simple shapes which sort of block out the volume that you're not wanting to go into. There are some exceptions to that, so if your characters move, there you go, I'm moving it around, I don't want to do that. If your character is walking over something, you want a fairly precise collision surface because it's going to look odd if you're floating above it. But there we go, so that's your basic collisions, and there's ways to add things. So I'm tempted to talk about the materials here, but I won't. I'll come back to that some other time. So here's an asset I made, which is very basic, simple. I just wanted a kettle. Gosh, that looks horrible. What is that? Oh, that was a plastic thing, bubbles. So this is a very simple, fairly ugly kettle. Basically a small variation on a cylinder. I didn't properly model the spout, but you don't need to really. 168 triangles. It's not a super high-res mesh, but it's a small prop. It's not really a significant part of a scene. It doesn't need very complicated collision. I noticed I'd forgotten to actually make a collision hull for this, so here we go. First way is very simple. There are these simplified collision shapes. I mean, you can look this up. They go from very simple sphere to the most complex shape with 26 D's, O's and P's. I forget what that stands for. So there is a better fit. Is it worth that extra complexity? I don't know. But that has one collision primitive. And you want as few of those as possible for the simple case to work well. I think that doesn't need so much. It will probably work well with... so you can choose the axis that's the most... well, let's see. So it's probably a Y one. Is it? No. But Y means something different in this one to Lightwave. Y is... it's a different one. So it's a Z which goes up and down. So that's probably more like it. And that will suffice. So that polygon has... well, I think it was 10... basically 10 sides. There's another possibility, which I've not played around with this much, so I don't tend to use these. I don't even see it down there. The convex decomposition, you can choose how accurate you want to be and how many vertices you want to have. Does a bit of a think about it, but that's a better solution. So that's fine, but these 16 vertices, it's too many. I mean, we don't need it for this. So let's just... Are you going to work for me? Right, I can't... so I'm going to select it and delete it. You can have multiple collision hulls present at any one time, it seems. That's a bit too simple. So I'm going to go back to my simplified collision. So that's fine. I've added a collision hull for that. So that's fair enough. We can do it for that. How about a bunk bed? Very simple model. Looks better in the browser than it does in the game. So this is basically a cube. I mean, you could add almost a very simple six-sided cube. Well, rhomboid, no, parallelogram. The one that's like a cube but squished. Anyway, 6 sides would do nicely. That'll block out the volume, so on and so forth. And Bob's your uncle or a close relative. But in this case, it's not ideal. In a game like Ground Branch, you got your weapons swinging around. If you walk into a room, you're not going to go climb into the bunk. But if you swing your gun in there, you're going to want it to swing in there and allow you to turn around and whatever. But you don't want it to go clunk on mid-air in line with those bunks. That's not going to work. So what I've done for this one is I did a custom collision where it actually very closely follows the shape of the bunk bed. This is using the facility to import a collision hull where you can have an arbitrary number of convex polygons They could be any sort of weird polygons like the ones you've seen, but actually I tend to just use cubes squished in various ways and combined and then deformed if necessary, but trying to avoid non-planar thingbobs because that never ends well. And so that has 12 primitives, 12 squished cubes, and that very closely defines the shape of it. So that is, I would say, a fairly optimal collision hull. You might think it's perhaps a bit much. I could have replaced each end with solid shapes maybe, but again, you know, I want the guns to be able to stick in through the holes there. So I'm pretty sure the guns will be following a simple collision, but I can't speak for the devs. I don't know what they're doing. And so I tended to define all my collision hulls in my model, and there's a way to do this. Hello, model. Oh yes, so I'm jumping the gun. So that's a bunk bed, and what do you do about an asset like that? You don't just stick on a 26-sided polygon, because this is something you're going to get very up close and personal with. You want to be able to lean into the doorways for a bit of cover maybe, and even if you're not using it for cover, if your weapon swings around and hits mid-air by the door, it's just a jarring, non-realistic thing. You want to maybe hit the drain pipe, have that get in the way. And then you've got up here, you've got a very complex shape of a walkway. You want to be able to have full freedom of movement around that, and that's a concave shape, so that's a little difficult to define a collision hull for because that has to be convex polygons. So actually what I've got here is quite a lot of polygons, the purple stuff. So 228 collision primitives, which are generally all 6-sided shapes. This might be too many. Maybe I've gone over the top, but I want this to define quite closely the shape of the building because you're going to be running around it, running on it in some cases with the pavement bits, and this is the level of detail I think I need. I'd have skimped in some areas, and for example these bits here with the soil I think are part of the collision hull because, you know, there's trees in the way in the level and that's just a bit too much. But I've tried to define holes for these windows and the like, which means I've got to mess about because everything's got to be convex. It's hard to actually make that indentation other than by surrounding it with other things. So that's the basic task, and I now need to do this for this block, which is here. It's going to slow to a crawl probably at this point. So this all needs to have collision hulls added. So I'll very quickly start doing that, and I won't do it all because it gets really boring, I can assure you. And here you can also see I've been working on the light map. I've been manually separating things out so they have enough space to breathe and get their own pixels rather than the pixels from something next door to it. And it's not complete, doesn't fully work. I've now started just doing the things that look glaringly wrong and leaving things that don't. So up here I've got all the pipe work for the drain pipes, the stuff that's at the top of the buildings, away from view, often with dark metallic colours. I've just squished together there in a sort of haphazard way because it's going to get messed up, but you won't really generally be able to notice from street level. But I've done more work on the ledges and things at ground level because they're most visible and they're most jarring if they're wrong. But yes, so that's on hold for now. It's good enough, sort of. And so what I'm going to do is make a new layer and bring everything else back as a background layer. And this is obviously specific to Lightwave, but I believe it's true for anything. If you make a layer, okay, so these are unnamed. I'm now going to name my layers. I think I called it Block Picasso something, but Block Picasso is fine. Doesn't matter what the names are, as far as I'm aware. So all my layers of things are Block Picasso, and then my new layer is going to be this one. I'm going to name UCX underscore Block Picasso, and this is a way to tell Unreal that this layer contains your collision hulls. I think there's other codes. There's another code for just spheres, I think, another thing for just cylinders or just cubes. This is for generic polygons, so this is perhaps overkill. But there we go. So anything I draw on this level is going to be treated as a collision hull. And so there are rules, it's got to be convex. So to give you an example, let's bring all this back. Doink, doink, doink. I want to make that the top view now. And it's basically just painstaking and tedious. So that front, I could just do that. So here's me making a cube. Also, the hulls I think can't overlap. So there's a lot of things that'd be nice just to get them to overlap slightly. So like if there's one for the facade and one for the roof, it'd be nice just to have them overlap in that region, but no, I think that makes it not work. At least it didn't in previous versions of the engine that I tried. Is that more or less up to there? So that's the first approximation, but it's no good because there's sort of portals into the building, so I need to do that. Now I'm going to cheat in various ways, but in select ways. So I'm going to ignore some of the gaps at high levels because they're not going to get tested very often, and I'll take a hit on the minor lack of realism. So again, ballistics will be done by poly, so it doesn't really affect that, but I'm thinking things about weapon collision where your character can run and walk and hide. And as another case I'm trying to bear in mind for the purpose of not killing realism is that you might, for example, lob grenades, and maybe that is done on a simple collision basis. I don't know, and I don't think the devs even know yet, but for sure. So some very big gaps, like for example this thing here, which has also another mesh on it in the editor. Maybe I'll leave that open because it's such a big opening. I want things to disappear into there. If somebody manages to lob a grenade in there for some reason, somehow, that's where I want it to be. So now you've got some jazzing where that's overlaid, but it should go away when I make that background again. So basically, it gets really tedious. So I might keep that. I'm going to ignore little bits sticking out like those ledges probably. I used to be more methodical, but now I don't care. It's good enough. I might need to have a little bit more definition to put the shutters in. And here I'm going to just define some cubes there. So the collision holes can go deeper than the actual polygons because there's going to be nothing underneath it in this case. If it was a more general mesh used for more general purposes, pardon me, I would make the collision holes stay fairly close to the visible extent. And I'm going to run that back because it goes deep into the building, and then by whatever means just sort of duplicate that around and tweak it to bring it in line. And it's all very well. It gets rather daunting when you have a huge amount of these hulls overlaid with this background stuff, and it just gets quite hard to work with. So you get the basic gist, and then I'm going to define another one in there. I'm leaving some of the buildings empty inside. They're not enterable, which I guess is lazy on my part, but for reasons I've probably discussed, it's just not going to be viable, I think, for a map of this size. I'll chuck it down there even. So if it looks painstaking, it pretty much is. That one's going to be a bit further back for that entrance, and there. Also hard to see what's going on. I'm going to need... Right, I'm going to edit this one. That's me isolating it. So there's some things I do an awful lot of, and unisolating it. Yeah. So I've done a lot of these now, and there's a way I do it, but it's really tedious. I shall subject you to a little more. And the rules are different to the visible polygons. I'm not removing hidden faces. If the polygon isn't fully defined, so a cube with 6 faces, then it doesn't work. It's got to be an enclosed volume. So I'm keeping the back faces, where the faces are wedged together, I'm keeping both of them. It's a slightly different process. And let's see, let's just... No. So I'm just trying to find ways to quickly duplicate stuff with the right size and then have it match up. So that's got to be all over there. I appreciate this might be a little confusing to watch. And Lightwave has its peculiarities and its funny interface. So that's defined that building pretty much. There may be something going on beyond there. Let's see. Yeah, so it indents a bit further, but I don't care about that. That's a small indent. You're not likely to notice that in practice. And that's really, I might define that little bit sticking out. But to be honest, I'm getting quite bored of this block. I want to move on. And I'll define things. I'll take some shortcuts. So this thing here, I'm going to, let's see, it's around there. If I was to cut it up like the original, that would create a concave surface, so I think that would fail. So I'd have to make individual cubes and stick them together. So I'm going to just take some liberties and get something that looks about the same. So I'm going to do that. And for now, this is good enough. I want to make sure it doesn't overlap. In fact, I'll keep it in the same place. And maybe I'll adjust the midpoint a bit. So that's not a perfect match, but it's much simpler, and it'll stop gross movement through that bit there. I probably want to take this bit away so that I can put the roof on, which I'll start there. I think it's there, isn't it? Oh, where's it gone? Alright, all the way over there. Alright, so that's more or less it, and then I'll just manually find the right. Okay, it's up there. Where's that going? So that's a approximation of that little bit at the end. Doesn't overlap, but I'll make it go a bit closer. In fact, I'll move that up to there. And so that's how I'm doing it. So it's a simplification, and I'll just copy that across. What's that? Yeah. And you know, and so it goes. Not much more to say, I think, but yeah, so some little tweaks, but you're basically painstakingly filling in the gaps with convex shapes, which you really most of the time wish were concave. So for example, how do you do this bit here? Well, I would probably fill in the sides. Where are we? That's more or less there. I don't want to intersect with the roof. I'd move. Oh, so that's gone wrong. I have 3 surfaces. Select all. I want 6 surfaces. So that's the sides defined. No, I'm going to change. It depends on the shape and whatever, but again, the necessity is to make it a convex shape. So This is sort of how I might do it. I might take 4 shapes to span that arch. And this one, I'm going to tweak that. It's still planar because it's all symmetrical and so on. So there's no... The further around I take it, the more it's not ideal, but maybe I'll do it this way. Is that convex if it's in a straight line? Better not risk it. So I'm making slightly odd shapes just to fit together. Yeah, I haven't quite got the right solution here. And that's now concave, so it's got to be that side of things. And then it just, oh, it's messy. I hate this. I'll see if I can do it in one more shape. There's other ways to fit this together. Maybe have slices going down and smaller slices, but I really want to use as few of these as possible. So that's probably fine. I mean, it's a high bit of arch. It's certainly more sophisticated a shape than in the sort of stock Unreal examples. I'm going to just copy them across. And the easy thing to do is just that kind of thing. And there you go. That wasn't in the middle, was it? Right, that's off. That's not off, that's off. So let's just move all of that along. That should hopefully have fixed it, yes. So that's how I do concave shapes. And I'll save the rest because it's really tedious. I've got a lot of, well, a few hours perhaps of doing this, maybe an hour. The heady rush of mapping, this bit, straight after the light mapping. So this is my least favourite bit, the light map and then the collision hulls, and it just takes so much time. But then it's basically good to go. And once that's imported, let's just do a test export. And I'll demonstrate what happens. I'm going to have to close some of these because it's running to a crawl. No. Right. So that's going to clear all the baked light maps when it gets there. Which it will do soon. There we go. So that's my dynamically lit building. And let's test it out. Boink. So I'll go through that, but when I get to here, so it'll let me go into the nooks and crannies nicely, and this, I can't get past that. So that's the basic principle. If we look at this, I'll turn on collision. You see the blue, the cyan, is essentially the polygons and how it's been snipped up. So in Lightwave that was a single polygon, but it's been snipped up into triangles horribly, and you can see the purple overlaid of the super precise collision hull. So I don't know if I'm being too precise with this. 25 collision primitives already. Maybe I'm being too pedantic. Maybe I should be more broad brush with it, because there is a slowdown when you have more things to check against. I guess it only does a collision check for things which you are impinging on, so the sort of sphere of well, the radius of them, whatever. But maybe that's going to slow things down, especially if it's a server doing checks for 8 people, 16 people on a server. It adds up, I guess. So you might get some odd slowdowns from this sort of approach. There is a reason, I'm sure, that Unreal, the Epic, have very, very simple collision hulls. But yeah, collision hulls. Ta-da! Bye-bye.